Now, the Americans had the Flying Fortress, and it was quite aptly named because it was covered in guns, and it was a bit of a fortress. But the British, on the other hand, had a flying battleship. Because this wasn't amphibious, this could only take off and land on water. And this thing was huge. Look at it, it's massive. And on top of that, it's covered in guns. And the Germans who encountered it very early on gave it the nickname the Flying Porcupine, because it has so many guns, it could shoot down pretty much anything that came at it. And one of the first things to come at it was a pair of ME-110s. Now, in theory, they should have been able to make short work of it. And they did give it an absolute battering, but it kept flying because it's tough as nails. And the thing is, it shot down one of them and made the other one so damaged that it had to turn tail and run, which means that this thing very quickly got a reputation as being something you just didn't want to go up against, even in the more advanced of the German fighters. So this is the short Sunderland, and what's good about this one is we can go inside and have a look. Now, it's very dark in here, so I don't know how well this will turn out, and I've had to wait ages for... She's going to start again. This lady's going to talk a lot. Anyway, what's quite surprising for an aircraft that's this big on the outside is quite how pokey it is on the inside. But right down there is where the gun is sat, and then not much kind of goes on here other than a bit of storage of munitions. But on the other side, it splits into two decks. The top deck is where the crew is and where the navigator is, and then the bottom deck is where the galley and where the bomber and all that kind of stuff goes on. Anyway, it's a bit noisy, so I don't know how well this is going to turn out, but we're going to move on to the next section. But I'm going to get out of shot just in case you can kind of see down there. It's very dark. Sorry about that. So you can kind of see up there that you've got the cockpit and you've got the navigator and the radio operator's space, and where a bunch of the flight kind of control went on. And then lower down, that heads to where you can get to the bombing position. So let's go and have a look at that. So this is the bomb area. See, being a flying boat, it's not very good to have a hole in the bottom where you can drop bombs from. So the solution was here. You've got these big flaps on the side here. I might have to turn this camera so that you can see those a little bit better. So you've got these big kind of doors here that you could lift up and seal, but then you had racks. So you'd mount the munitions onto these racks, and then they'd be pushed out over the wings and then dropped onto the unsuspecting U-boats below. And that was essentially how it dropped depth charges, how it dropped bombs, how it dropped any of its munitions. I believe, I'm not 100% sure on this, but I believe they also had like a survival pack they could drop for downed air crew, though this, generally speaking, would just land and pick them up, because even in pretty rough chop, this could actually just land on the sea and it was just a ship, because it's so big, it can cope with some quite rough weather. But yeah, this is basically where munitions are yeeted off the side of the aircraft and onto the enemy below. So it's probably a bit dark to see it properly, but this is a galley. So you had a little hob thing here, and the grill and various bits of others. And on some of them, they actually set them up so they could bake bread, so they could make fresh bread. Because the whole point of this aircraft was that it could fly for up to 18-hour missions. It could be out on mission, on patrol for considerable durations. So they tried to give it a few creature comforts, like a galley, the ability to make hot food, just to make it a little bit more livable for the crew. And then forward of that space, you have a couple of bench seats and bits to carry extra passengers, or your picked up RAF aircrew that have been shot down over the channel or wherever. So there's a little bit of a compartment here for them. And then forward of there, well, we'll go and have a look at that now. And then right here at the front end, you've got your observation point. You've got your forward gun turret that's just there. You can kind of see it there's like a hatch just at the front by that window. And then there's 4 of these machine guns sat on the front of here. And I'll tell you what they're for in a minute. Just because every crew needs its creature comforts, you've got a toilet, like an actual sit-down proper toilet on this aircraft, because like I said, this thing could be in the air for 18 hours. So doesn't hurt to have a few creature comforts. So as I mentioned, it's massive on the outside, but it's actually quite compact on the inside. It's quite a lot of stuff squeezed into a small space internally. And there was quite a lot of crew inside one of these, but there's actually, most of these had one extra unofficial crew, which took the form of a ship's cat. Quite often they would have a cat on board these because these couldn't land on an airstrip, so when they weren't in use, they'd quite often be moored for extended periods. And ships that are moored, boats that are moored, quite often get rats because the rats climb along the mooring ropes and they find their way on board. And these things quite often had food stores inside, and they had Well, they had all kinds of things like caulking and cables and stuff like that rats quite like to chew at and damage. And you don't want to really fly an aircraft and then find halfway across the Atlantic that a rat has chewed through a whole cable that, you know, connects some rather important bit to something. So they'd have a cat on board, and the cat would help keep the infestation and pest problem down, and in return got to fly around the world. Right, now we're back outside. It may be that the video actually starts from here because it turns out all the footage was too dark and you couldn't see anything. But hopefully you got something out of that. But as you can see, from the outside you can see how the munitions were on racks that were then like lifted out over the wings and then dropped from there. You know, because like I said, it's a boat. So you can't have a bomb bay like a conventional bomber because it tends to let seawater in. And these were very good boats. It was very stable at sea. You've got these massive floats halfway down the wing that help to stabilise it. And its main job was hunting U-boats. It was there for reconnaissance and air-sea rescue, but the main job of it was actually hunting U-boats. And to that end, you have depth charges it can yeet out of the sides, but also a stack of machine guns on the front, so you can strafe the decks of surfaced U-boats. Along with the regular machine guns, it did have, out of these two back windows here, they're not there at the minute, but it had a couple of 50 cals that poked out of there, and then it's got a couple of machine guns on the back in the turret. So very well armoured aircraft, and it was tough. So they built a civilian version of this, and they built the military version. And the military version was basically the civilian version, but toughened up, so it could stand the kind of low-level flying and more kind of abusive flying, if you like, that this would have to take. But ironically, after the war, when these were decommissioned out of the military, a lot of these ended up flying as civilian airliners. They were converted into civilian airliners because they'd outlasted the original civilian versions of these. I think it was called the Empire version or something. I don't know, I'd have to look that up. But right offhand, I can't remember. But there was basically a civilian version of this, and it didn't last as long as the military one, so that ended up being the civilian version. I mean, that's pretty much it for the Sunderland. There's obviously a lot more detail you can go into, but very effective aircraft, and within minutes of getting into the war, it shot down two very capable German heavy fighters, the Me-110, and got itself a reputation of being called the Porcupine. But on top of that, it also went out against a U-boat, and the U-boat was surfaced, and the U-boat, for whatever reason, decided to try and take this down with the flat cannon. Now, they assumed that the U-boat would just crash dive and try and escape, and they'd have just dropped depth charges on it. But it didn't. It stayed on the surface and it wailed on this with its anti-aircraft cannons. But in return, this used all of the many guns on board to shoot back. Now, bearing in mind you've got 4 machine guns at the back, you've got a pair of 50 cal sticking out the side, you've got another set at the front, and you've got 4 guns at the front that the pilot can just strafe the deck with. It didn't take long before this thing turned the U-boat into mincemeat. It took an absolute battering from the flat cannon, but because they're so solidly built, it carried on with its mission and carried on with the war. The U-boat, on the other hand, turned into a coral reef. So that's the short Sunderland, basically. Yeah, I'll probably revisit it at some point because it is quite an impressive aircraft and there is a lot more to its history, but essentially this was the one aircraft in the RAF that was allowed to carry cats.